Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Joe Connor from Carthage Veterinary Service. How are you doing today, Joe?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Laura.
Well, good. Glad to have you on today. If you wouldn't mind giving our audience just a little bit of a background about who you are and a little bit about your veterinary experience over the years, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I'm a long-term veterinarian based in West Central Illinois, part of the group of Carthage Veterinary Service and Professional Swine Management, and now work as a consultant back to that group. Also have been involved in pig production through years, and also have a part-time position at the University of Illinois.
Very good. Well, Joe, you're known worldwide, obviously, for your veterinarian skills and particularly your discussion around health. And I know early in your career, you were involved with 𝘧𝘪𝘵's elimination in the United States. And so we really thought today would be a good time just to visit with you a little bit and get your perspective on maybe how you've seen disease change in the swine industry from early in your career to now, and then also maybe a little bit about your projections as to what you think is going to happen in the future.
Well, you immediately show my age, Laura, when you talk about and refer back to 𝘧𝘪𝘵's. But I think it was a good model, and as I think at that time period compared to now, a big difference is we were working in uncharted waters with the program that was being pushed forward. The industry and the veterinary community recognized that 𝘧𝘪𝘵's had an economic consequence to our industry. And there was a lot of discussions about the success of an elimination program on a wide basis. We're quite fortunate, though, that diagnostics developed, and in the later stages of the program, very effective and differential vaccines were developed to really help move that program successfully forward. Mm-hmm. As we think about today, we do have tremendous advancements in diagnostic technology, and we're able to use that technology to better understand the extensiveness of the pathogen or the disease within the population, and use that information to, I think, more aggressively go at least individual herd elimination programs.
I think that's a really interesting point. One of the things that I hear in terms of chatter is, particularly as we look going forward and with the current situation in terms of what's happening in the Dominican Republic and Haiti with ASF, is this potential concern of how do we manage a new disease, right? We knew in 2013 when PED came in, there was a lot of work around controlling it, trying to eliminate it. Now, obviously, it's endemic in the US. And so what do you see as far as how we're going to manage diseases in the future?
I think if we back up and we think about what has changed over the last 20 years, it's been our pig flow and our separation from the breed to wean to the growing pig population. All of that was based on the premise of actually disease management, but more importantly, improved performance, particularly in the grow finish phase. And with that, as that system developed, it then became easier to eliminate diseases in each of those production phases. So now we had the separated pig flow from the breed to wean unit. So that opened up a lot of flexibility, Laura, in how we could approach disease management and disease elimination. At the same time, it also allowed the industry to grow our inventory. And so, as we all recognize today, we have larger populations located in many of the premises, which that by itself influences the disease activity, at least in certain geographical areas. One of the challenges I think we do face is if we go back and we look at your example of PED and then porcine Delta coronavirus, was that it emphasized that we have methods of transmission that we previously did not think were all that important. So stimulated research by you and others to say, are we transferring those type of pathogens in the feed or transportation fomites? So for me, it's opened up a lot of what I refer to as practical research back to the farm level in terms of how disease pathogens are transmitted, and then opens up approaches of how do we do control of that transmission as we go forward. I think one of the interesting things that we learned, Laura, out of PED was that we originally thought we had a method to eliminate it out of a particular herd, and over about a 2-year time period, we actually got quite good at eliminating that particular virus out of herds. I think as you remember back, we had some of those situations where we cleaned and disinfected 6, 7, 8 times and still had virus activity. Well, it turns out we didn't quite understand where the transmission was occurring and what the influence of a quite young pig, in this case a suckling pig, contributed to the concentration of virus and the spread of that virus within a particular herd. I would say today we've got quite good at reducing the number of days that we have losses within a PED herd or a Delta coronavirus herd. Now the question comes is, should we eliminate that virus from the industry as a whole? I think we've recognized the modes of transmission, and the next step would be then to back up and say, what do we need to do as an industry to complete the elimination out of the North American industry? Mm-hmm. As I think forward, and if we think about what is occurring with ASF, a risk clearly have increased here now that the virus is in the Western Hemisphere, and with the situation that does exist within Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and not only movement of people, but then becomes the increased risk of their movement of products. At the same time, our industry is really through 𝘫𝑖C has taken a very practical and aggressive approach with the authorities and to try to minimize that risk and also understand the important methods of transmission. So if we compare that, though, to your earlier question on pseudorabies, we don't have an effective vaccine yet. So, and we don't have a differential vaccine now. Just last week it was announced that the studies are quite promising, at least on the gene-deleted vaccine as being effective and as being safe. So that work needs to continue, as well as the diagnostic technology in order to allow early identification and then control and elimination.
When you look at the farm level, so I'm going to take you a couple of different directions here, because I know you've traveled worldwide and been in countries where ASF has been around at least for a few years now. So we've learned some lessons that maybe can help prepare us for what we can do or should be doing here in the U.S. to hopefully prevent spread and movement. What would be some things at the farm level that you would encourage our producers to be doing today?
Yeah, it's a good question, Laura, and I'd separate it in two different geographical areas or approaches. So one, if we look at Russia as an example, or the former Soviet Union, those large systems over the last 5 to 7 years have actually gotten fairly good at preventing ASF or entry, and if it does enter, in controlling it, limiting it to one building, one part of the site, moving quickly to then elimination out of that population. To do that, they've enhanced the biosecurity. So they've, very much like we do here, so vehicle washes, but more intense inspection of transportation, inspection of products that would come into the farm, more tight storage of products, double fencing, isolation facilities for incoming animals, pig side tests that would allow early confirmation and removal of animals. Now, it's not perfect because just last week or 2 weeks ago was announced one of the systems has experienced an outbreak of ASF. If I compare that or contrast that to China, which is a different industry as it modernizes, the similar biosecurity steps have been put in place, but not yet as intense and controlled because of the difference in the industry. Size of the producers, number of producers, historical method of raising pigs, all of that is not as developed, but is quickly developing than similar to what you and I are used to. One of the things that did come out of the virus movement in China was that with the virus itself, there was a number of herds that were successful in actually identifying the virus early and removing those animals and then saving the rest of the population. That, as you know, has gotten challenged, though, because there was modified live vaccines that were also introduced as a method to reduce mortality. Those vaccines, in some cases, have evolved with the virus itself, making more of an endemic picture, and so making what was quite a successful method of removal, identification removal, much more difficult to do today. So they're now in a situation where, in many cases, where the virus is endemic and the practices that they were using 18 months ago or 12 months ago are more challenged now than what they were.
Yeah, that's very good. I think you offered some really good insight there and what's happening in other countries, and hopefully give our producers a little bit of things to think about. So I'm going to switch back now to, instead of talking about ASF, let's talk about things that are obviously already here that we're dealing with. And I've worked with you a couple of times with some farms where you were working through a mycoplasma elimination. And can you walk people through the approach to how you attack a mycoplasma elimination on a farm?
I think that's an interesting disease, because if you go back to the early part of my career when it was known as enzootic pneumonia, we would have had populations through the SPF program that we would have identified as being mycoplasma negative. And then our industry lived with this pathogen and consequent disease for a number of years until the research actually got stimulated by Europe, where we could see that the pathogen could be eliminated, at least on a small-scale basis. And then when that information was recognized here in the U.S., and then research coming forth from Maria Peters and others, that gave us an indication of how long an individual animal that was infected would shed that particular pathogen. And at the same time, looking at serology and exposure within herds, we recognize that one of the stabilizing populations were our introduction of mycoplasma negative gilts into a positive, even though it might be stable herd. Those gilts would then undergo infection, and with Dr. Peters' work, we recognize that those gilts themselves at farrowings P1s would be a primary method of transmission to the young pig. Then the work came forth that showed that what was the cost or is the cost of Mycoplasma 𝘲𝑚𝘧𝑖, and whether it's singly or in combination of other viruses such as 𝘧𝘪𝘳𝘴 influenza. So it heightened the cost of that particular pathogen and made us look at, is there a way that we could eliminate that from our populations? I think most of us, Laura, would say that when you have potential for multiple pathogens, you continue to look for the one that you can eliminate so that you take it out of the complex, and then you can start thinking about the next one. And so very common today for us to first expose replacement gilts to mycoplasma through an aerosol method. And we focus to get that completed before they are about 80 days of age, so that by the time they farrow, they're no longer shedding that pathogen to their offspring. Then that leads us to the elimination program, using a combination of the natural exposure, then herd closure for the 240 days, and at the end of that program, intervention with antibiotics on the suckling pigs and generally the sow population. And pretty predictably will then result in a population where we've eliminated the pathogen from the sow population, the breed-to-wean population. Then, of course, we eliminate it with the downstream flow just by all-in-all-out movement of animals. So it's been quite a success story for the industry, and it is picking up momentum where you could say, do we need to move to a broader-based program of elimination, and is it one that we can do locally and then by area and then by region? So I think looking forward, it opens up some really good opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's really interesting is, when you start talking to people, everybody wants to say, well, let's eliminate this disease and this disease and this disease. And what I'm really hearing is we need to take this as a systematic approach, and let's be successful controlling one disease before we move, obviously, to the next disease. And when you and I used to talk, mycoplasma, while it can move, it doesn't move maybe as easily as some of our other diseases. And so if we can be successful with mycoplasma, then potentially we can move on to some other diseases. Is that a fair thought process, or is there a different way to think about that?
No, that's a great thought process. And I think you bring up a great point that we also had to settle on for Mycoplasma 𝘲𝑚𝘧𝑖. And that is, we thought it moved some distance by aerosol, but if you look at the data in the Minnesota study, most of the time that is quite a short distance, and we can put pigs in a finisher right in pig dense areas, and they do not become contaminated with Mycoplasma 𝘲𝑚𝘧𝑖. So that answered the question of, if we input the cost to eliminate a sow herd, will we be able to maintain those populations negative? And we now know that's true. And you probably remember in those early segregated production days, we thought that it only moved about 300 yards. So we set some of those facilities about 1,000 feet away. We now know it moves a little bit more than that. But generally, with good biosecurity, that then becomes a good step that we can eliminate that particular type of pathogen. And then the other point that you really emphasized to me, and if you look at our industry and you look at the number of pathogens we've eliminated over the years, it's quite a long list. But generally, each one of those start out as an individual herd, to your point, and identifying the factors that contribute to transmission within the herd, and then what interventions can we make to stop that transmission. And we link that with the value matrix, and then it drives us really one herd at a time, and then we modify the approach to become what we think is the most cost-effective approach to successfully eliminate that pathogen out of the population.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, I'm going to change gears on you just a little bit, Joe. I know you've worked with veterinarians right out of college over the years, and just kind of looking back at your lessons learned in the veterinary career, what would be a couple of key items that you would like young veterinarians to be thinking about as they start their careers?
You're tackling my age again, Laura. But
sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I think early on I probably made it a little bit too difficult. So one of the things I've learned is that it is about listening or observing what the pigs themselves are doing. It's about asking questions so that you know what really the objective is when you're in that barn. And it is about being in the barn and putting together the information that you have. I would tell young veterinarians that, keep it simple, because if we think about what action we want within the barn, the caregiver of the pig really needs to have it straightforward, because you're going to have to carry the action out to get the result that an individual wants. Many times as a young veterinarian, I'm sure I gave them way too many options, feeling that was giving them the broad spectrum, allowing them to understand how decisions were made, but later recognizing that only confuses the issue, because they're the ones that have to execute the final actions. So it's important also to know who is the action person versus who within the company needs the broader base of reasoning or objectives. The next thing I would say is that it's always helpful to focus on some metric. And so that helps focus the objective. It could be as simple as the cough index, the scour index, but ultimately it is the cost and a value matrix. And so focusing on that then helps sharpen the decision-making process. Clearly, we continue to develop on how to grab that data and how to put it into a value matrix. At the same time, we need to get that out to the pig always, so that there's actionable items.
Mm-hmm. Very good tips. And I wholeheartedly agree. If we don't keep it simple in the barns, it's hard for our individuals to accomplish our objectives. And then, of course, listening. We always will talk about listen to what the pigs are telling you, listen to what the people are telling you, and put that together. It's very good. Well, as we wrap up our time together, we do like to ask Joe a couple of common questions to all of our guest speakers. So the first question we like to ask is, what is your favorite swine resource book?
Well, I'd be amiss if I didn't say The Diseases of Swine, right? But
right.
What I do, Laura, is I actually try to look at recent articles first for whatever the problem is that we're facing, and then go back to like the disease of swine as a reference, because I find that linking those two together helps me get a progression of my thought process and maybe areas to continue to look at.
Mm-hmm. Very good. How about a non-swine resource book? Is there anything that you're currently reading or have read that you would recommend to the audience?
Well, one of the interesting ones that I have read is When Breath Becomes Air. And that's about a 36-year-old neurosurgeon that right as he's finishing his education, finds he's developed stage 4 lung cancer. So the progression there is, how do we move through the understanding of length of life and how do we make decisions as you progress through that? Interesting because he's also a great author, as well as his understanding was to try to, or his goal in life was try to understand how the brain operates to help us develop a personality and make decisions.
Very interesting. I've not heard of that book. I'll have to pick that one up and read it. Sounds like a very good story. The last question I like to ask our speakers is really around, if you think of people in the industry that you have defined as being successful, and it can be any part of the industry, what characteristics do you identify as helping them be successful?
I think, Laura, the successful ones are all passionate about what they do. So in this case, they're passionate about pigs. At the same time, they're very curious, and so they are looking for avenues, opportunities of new information, but they have the ability to apply that information back to either their own herd or their own task at hand. And then with that, they've got the ability to execute that and finish that task.
Mm-hmm. I've heard curiosity a couple of times recently, so I think that's actually a really intriguing one. And it's just that you hit the nail on the head. It's not just being curious, but it's then putting an action behind that curiosity and making a change from what you're observing. So very good characteristic for people to think about. So as we conclude our time, I want to thank you, Joe, for being on our podcast today. And for our audience, this is Dr. Joe Conner. Again, Joe, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.